In the dust-covered town of Socorro, New Mexico, 1878, three little girls would speak words that would shake the foundations of everything their community believed about family, race, and what it truly means to be a mother. Their father, a respected rancher, had just brought home a captured Apache woman in chains. The townspeople expected justice. The children saw something else entirely. What happened next would challenge every assumption about civilization and savagery, about who deserves love and who deserves chains. This is not just a story about the Old West. This is a story about the moment when innocent eyes saw truth that adult prejudice had blinded an entire town to see. Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the smallest voices. Sometimes children can see a mother's heart beating beneath the scars of a warrior. And, sometimes, three little words spoken by a child can change the destiny of everyone involved. This is the true story of how love conquered fear, how family was redefined by courage, and how an Apache woman's journey from captivity to belonging would teach an entire community what it really means to be human. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor when Jake Morrison first saw the smoke rising from the Henderson ranch. From his position on the rocky outcrop where he had been tracking the missing cattle, the black column against the pale sky told a story he had seen too many times before. Apache raiders had struck again. Jake spurred his horse down the treacherous slope, his weathered hands gripping the reins tight. At 42, he had lived in this corner of New Mexico territory long enough to know the difference between a grass fire and the deliberate burning that came with an attack. The acrid smell that reached his nostrils confirmed his worst fears. By the time he reached the Henderson place, the main house was nothing but smoldering timbers. The barn had been stripped of horses and supplies. Jake found Tom Henderson face down in the dirt yard, 3 arrows in his back, his wife Martha nearby with her skull crushed. They had been good people, honest ranchers trying to make a life in this hard country. Jake removed his hat and said a quiet prayer for their souls. Then, he began the grim task of reading the signs left behind. The unshod horse prints in the dust told him there had been perhaps 8 or 10 warriors in the raiding party. They had come from the north, hit hard and fast, then disappeared back into the maze of canyons and mesas that provided perfect hiding places for those who knew the land. The tracks were fresh, maybe 3 hours old. Jake knew he should ride back to Socorro for help, gather a proper posse with enough men and guns to handle Apache warriors. But something in the tracks made him hesitate. Mixed in with the unshod prints of Indian ponies, he saw the smaller hoofprints of a shod horse being led, not ridden. A white man's horse, probably taken from the Henderson spread. Jake's jaw tightened as he followed the trail. 3 miles from the ranch, he found confirmation of what he had suspected. In a small clearing protected by tall rocks, the raiding party had stopped to rest and divide their spoils. Scattered around a cold fire pit were torn pieces of clothing that had belonged to the Hendersons, along with broken pottery and the scattered remains of their meager possessions. But it was what he found at the edge of the clearing that made Jake's blood run cold. Boot prints in the sand, small and delicate. A woman's boots. The raiders had taken a captive. Jake had heard the stories whispered around campfires and in saloons. White women taken by Apache war parties rarely lived long, and those who did often wished they had not. The thought of some helpless woman in the hands of those savages made his hands shake with rage. He followed the trail deeper into the Badlands, using every skill his years on the frontier had taught him. The Apache were clever, splitting their party and reuniting it, crossing streams to confuse their tracks, even backtracking to lay false trails. But Jake Morrison had been hunting men and animals in this country for over 20 years. He was patient, methodical, and he never gave up once he had the scent. The sun was beginning to set when he finally found them. The Apache camp was hidden in a narrow canyon, invisible from above and protected on 3 sides by sheer rock walls. Jake counted 9 warriors and twice as many horses. They had grown careless with success, confident that no white man would be foolish enough to follow them alone into this wilderness. Jake belly crawled to the rim of the canyon, his rifle ready. Below him, the Apache were preparing their evening meal, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. He did not speak their language, but their relaxed manner told him they felt safe. Then, he saw her. The captive sat apart from the main group, her hands bound behind her back and her feet tied together with rawhide rope. But something was wrong. This was not the helpless white woman he had expected to find. The captive was Apache herself, a woman of perhaps 25 years, with long black hair and the distinctive clothing of her people. Her face bore fresh bruises, and there was a defiance set to her shoulders that spoke of recent struggle. Jake frowned, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Why would Apache warriors take one of their own women captive? As he watched, one of the braves walked over to the woman and spoke to her harshly. She turned her face away, refusing to look at him. The warrior struck her across the cheek, and she spat at his feet. Understanding began to dawn on Jake. This woman was not a captive in the way he had imagined. She was a prisoner, but the conflict was between Apache and Apache, not between red and white. Perhaps she was from a different band, taken in some internal tribal dispute. Or perhaps she had committed some crime that had earned her this treatment. Whatever the reason, Jake found himself in an impossible situation. His original plan had been simple: track down the raiders, rescue any captives, and deliver justice for the murder of the Hendersons. But now he faced a dilemma that his frontier experience had not prepared him for. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to retreat quietly and return with a full posse. 9 Apache warriors were more than any single man could handle, no matter how skilled or well armed. But, as Jake watched the woman below, something in her bearing reminded him of his own daughters back in Socorro. She was someone's child, someone's sister, maybe someone's mother. And she was suffering. Jake had always prided himself on being a practical man, not given to romantic notions about noble savages or the brotherhood of mankind. Apache were Apache, and they had killed too many good people for him to have any illusions about their nature. But this woman had not killed the Hendersons. She was as much a victim of this raiding party as Tom and Martha had been. The decision, when it came, surprised Jake himself with its suddenness. He would not leave her here. Moving with the patience of a natural hunter, Jake worked his way around the rim of the canyon until he found a spot where the rock wall was broken by a series of ledges and handholds. It would be a dangerous climb, especially in the growing darkness, but it was the only way down that would not expose him to the warriors below. Jake checked his weapons one final time. His rifle was loaded and ready, and his Colt revolver rode easy in its holster. He had 2 spare cylinders for the pistol and a full belt of ammunition for the rifle. If this went badly, he intended to make the Apache pay dearly for his life. The climb down took nearly an hour. Every movement had to be calculated, every handhold tested before he committed his weight to it. Loose stones that might betray his presence had to be carefully avoided. By the time he reached the canyon floor, full darkness had settled over the desert. The Apache camp was perhaps 50 yards away, illuminated by the flickering light of their fire. Jake could see the woman more clearly now. She had not moved from her position, but her eyes were alert, scanning the darkness around the camp with the wariness of someone who knew that safety was always an illusion in this hard country. Jake made his way closer, using every bit of cover the rocky canyon provided. He was within 20 feet of the woman when she saw him. Their eyes met across the firelit space, and Jake saw her tense for what he thought would be a cry of alarm. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been calculation. She was taking his measure, trying to decide whether this white man represented salvation or simply a different kind of danger. Jake held his finger to his lips, the universal gesture for silence. The woman's eyes flicked toward the warriors around the fire, then back to Jake. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, she gave the slightest nod of her head. Moving with infinite care, Jake crept around the edge of the camp. The Apache were absorbed in their meal and their conversation, confident in their safety. Jake positioned himself behind a large boulder that would give him cover and a clear field of fire toward the main group of warriors. Then, he made his move. The first shot took the lead warrior in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the fire. The sudden explosion of light and sparks scattered the other Apache, who scrambled for their weapons while trying to locate the source of the attack. Jake's second shot caught another warrior as he reached for his rifle. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, shattering the bone and putting him out of the fight. The remaining Apache finally located Jake's position and began returning fire, their bullets chipping the rock around his hiding place and whining off into the darkness. The battle was fierce but brief. Jake had the advantages of surprise and position, but the Apache had numbers and desperation. They tried to flank him, working around the sides of his boulder fortress, but Jake had chosen his position well. The narrow confines of the canyon limited their options, and his superior firepower began to tell. When the shooting stopped, 5 Apache warriors lay dead around the dying fire. 2 others had been wounded badly enough to retreat into the darkness, leaving trails of blood that would be easy to follow come morning. The last 2 had simply vanished, melting away into the night like the ghosts they were trained to be. Jake reloaded his weapons and approached the captive woman cautiously. She had not moved during the entire battle, though flying bullets had passed close enough to her position to part her hair. When Jake knelt to cut her bonds, she looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and spoke a single word in English. "Why?" Jake paused in cutting the rawhide that bound her wrists. It was a good question, one he was not sure he could answer. Why had he risked his life for an Apache woman? Why had he chosen to fight 9 warriors alone when the smart thing would have been to retreat and return with help? Because it was right, he said finally, sawing through the tough leather. The woman rubbed her freed wrists, working circulation back into her hands. She studied Jake's face in the firelight as if trying to solve some complex puzzle. "My name is Ayanna," she said in careful English. "You are either very brave or very foolish, white man." "Name's Jake Morrison," he replied, moving to cut the bonds around her feet. "And I reckon I'm probably a little of both." Ayanna stood slowly, testing her legs after hours of confinement. She was smaller than Jake had realized, probably no more than 5.5 feet tall, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of hard-earned resilience. Her buckskin dress was torn and dirty, but it was well made and decorated with intricate beadwork that marked her as a woman of some standing within her people. "These men," she said, gesturing toward the bodies around the fire, "they killed my husband and my brother. They took me too." She paused, searching for the right words in English. "To make me wife to their chief. I would rather die." Jake nodded, beginning to understand the situation. This had been a kidnapping, probably connected to some power struggle within the Apache community. Ayanna was valuable to someone, valuable enough to risk a raid deep into territory patrolled by the army and local ranchers. "Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore," Jake said. "But we need to get out of here before those 2 that got away come back with reinforcements." Jake gathered what supplies he could from the Apache camp, including several water pouches and some dried meat. He also retrieved the horses that had been taken from the Henderson ranch, recognizing Tom Henderson's favorite mare among the string of ponies. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Ayanna touched Jake's arm. "The White family," she said. "The man and woman who owned these horses. Are they dead?" Jake said simply. "These bastards killed them both." Ayanna closed her eyes for a moment, and Jake saw something that might have been grief pass across her face. When she opened them again, there was a hardness there that had not been present before. "Then, justice has been done," she said quietly. They climbed out of the canyon under the light of a full moon, leading the recovered horses. Jake set a pace that was fast but sustainable, knowing that they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the sight of the battle before dawn brought the possibility of pursuit. As they rode through the desert night, Jake found himself stealing glances at his unusual companion. Ayanna sat her horse with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. She showed no sign of fear or uncertainty, despite being alone with a white man in the middle of hostile territory. If anything, she seemed more alert and alive than she had during her captivity. "Where will you take me?" she asked during a brief rest to water the horses. Jake considered the question. The logical thing would be to turn her over to the Indian agent at the reservation, but something about that idea sat poorly with him. Ayanna had been a victim in all of this, not a perpetrator. She deserved better than being shuffled into the grinding bureaucracy that managed the remnants of the Apache people. "I reckon that depends," he said finally. "Do you have family? Somewhere safe you can go?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time.
My husband's people will blame me for his death. My own people. She shrugged. I am no longer welcome among them. I have nowhere to go.
The simple honesty of her statement hit Jake harder than he had expected. Here was a woman who had lost everything: husband, family, home, place in the world, and yet she bore it with a dignity that humbled him. She was asking nothing of him, expecting nothing, simply stating the facts of her situation without self-pity or despair. As they resumed their journey toward Socorro, Jake found himself thinking about his own family waiting at home. His wife Sarah had died 2 years ago from pneumonia, leaving him to raise their 3 daughters alone. Mary was 12, Beth was 10, and little Annie was only 8. They had a housekeeper, Mrs. Garcia, who helped during the day, but Jake knew his girls were growing up without the gentle influence that only a mother could provide. The thought that came to him was so unexpected that he almost rejected it immediately. But, as the miles passed and he watched Ayana's quiet strength and dignity, the idea began to take root. Socorro came into view just as the sun was rising over the eastern mountains. The small town was already stirring to life, with smoke rising from chimneys and the first merchants opening their shops. Jake led them to the livery stable, where old Pete Martinez greeted him with surprise. "Jake, heard you was out tracking them Apache that hit the Henderson place. Find anything?" "Found Tom and Martha dead," Jake said grimly. "And I found this lady, who was their prisoner." Pete's eyes went wide as he took in Ayana's appearance. Jake could see the questions forming in the old man's mind, along with the assumptions and prejudices that would follow. This was the moment of truth, the first test of the decision that had been forming in Jake's mind during the long ride home. "Pete," Jake said carefully, "I'd appreciate it if you keep quiet about this for now. I need to talk to Sheriff Williams before word gets around." Pete nodded, but Jake could see that the secret would not keep long. In a town the size of Socorro, news traveled fast, and the arrival of an Apache woman would be the biggest story in months. Jake helped Ayana down from her horse and led her toward the main street. She moved through the town with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout their journey, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed in their wake. As they walked, Jake made his decision. It was crazy, probably impossible, and it would certainly cause talk that would last for years. But sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. "Ayana," he said quietly, "I want to ask you something. But first I need to know, can you read and write?" She looked at him with surprise. "My husband taught me. He learned from the missionaries." "Why do you ask?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Around them, the town of Socorro was waking up to what would become one of the most remarkable days in its history. "Because I'm about to make you an offer that's going to shock this whole town," Jake said. "And I want to make sure you understand exactly what you'd be getting into." Jake Morrison's house sat at the edge of Socorro, a modest adobe structure with a wide front porch and a view of the distant mountains. It was a home built for a family, with 3 small bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a parlor where Sarah Morrison had once entertained the other ranchers' wives on Sunday afternoons. As Jake and Ayana approached the house, the front door burst open and 3 young girls came running out. Mary, the eldest at 12, had her mother's blonde hair and serious blue eyes. Beth, 2 years younger, was all energy and motion, bouncing on her toes as she waited for her father's attention. Little Annie, barely 8 years old, hung back shyly, sucking her thumb despite being told repeatedly that big girls did not do such things. "Papa!" Beth called out. "Mrs. Garcia said you'd be back yesterday. We were worried about you." Jake knelt down and gathered his daughters in his arms, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that came whenever he was reminded of how much they needed him. These 3 little girls were his whole world now, the only family he had left. "I'm sorry I was late, girls," he said. "I ran into some trouble out at the Henderson place." He paused, glancing up at Ayana, who stood quietly behind him. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." Mary, who was old enough to read the serious tone in her father's voice, looked past him to where Ayana waited. The girl's eyes went wide as she took in the Apache woman's appearance, the buckskin dress, the long black hair, the distinctive features that marked her as one of the people who had been both enemy and neighbor to the settlers of this territory.
Papa, Mary said slowly, who is that lady?
Jake stood up, his hands resting on his daughter's shoulders.
This was the moment he had been dreading during the entire ride back to Socorro. How do you explain to 3 young girls that you have brought home an Apache woman? How do you make them understand that the person standing before them was not the savage monster that their nightmares and the town's whispered stories had painted?
Her name is Ayanna, Jake said carefully. She was in trouble, and I helped her. Now she needs a place to stay. Beth, who had inherited her father's direct nature along with his stubborn streak, stepped closer to get a better look at Ayanna. Are you an Indian? She asked with the blunt honesty that only children possess.
Beth.
Mary hissed, embarrassed by her sister's directness. But Ayanna smiled for the first time since Jake had known her, and knelt down to bring herself to Beth's eye level.
Yes, little one, I am Apache. Does that frighten you?
Beth considered this question with the gravity it deserved.
Papa says we shouldn't be afraid of people just because they're different.
He says what matters is what's in their heart.
Ayanna glanced up at Jake with something that might have been approval. Your father is a wise man. And what do you think is in my heart?
Beth studied Ayanna's face with the penetrating stare that children use to see through adult deceptions. After a long moment, she said, I think you're sad.
And I think maybe you're a little scared, too.
You are very smart for one so young, Ayanna said softly.
Yes, I am both of those things.
But I am also grateful to your father for helping me. Little Annie had crept closer during this exchange, her curiosity overcoming her natural shyness. Are you going to live with us? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Jake felt all eyes turn toward him, his daughters waiting for an answer, Ayanna watching to see what he would say, and, somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Garcia peering through the kitchen window with undisguised curiosity. That depends, Jake said carefully, on whether Ayanna wants to stay, and whether you girls think it would be a good idea. Mary, who had been watching this entire exchange with the serious consideration of someone far older than her 12 years, spoke up.
What would she do here? I mean, if she stayed?
Jake had been thinking about that question during the long ride home, turning over possibilities in his mind like a gambler examining his cards. Now, with his daughters' earnest faces turned toward him, he found himself speaking words that surprised even him. Well, he said slowly, you girls have been without a mother for 2 years now. Mrs. Garcia does her best, but she has her own family to care for. I thought maybe, if Ayanna was willing, she could help take care of you.
Teach you things. Be like a mother to you.
The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind rattling the wooden shutters of the house. Mary's mouth had fallen open slightly, and Beth was staring at him as if he had just announced that he was planning to sprout wings and fly to the moon. It was Annie who broke the silence, stepping forward and taking Ayanna's hand in her small one. Would you like to see my dolls? She asked with the simple trust that children reserve for those they instinctively know to be safe. Ayanna looked down at the little girl holding her hand, and Jake saw something break inside her, not in a bad way, but like ice breaking up in spring, allowing something warm and vital to flow through. I would like that very much, she said, her voice thick with emotion. As Annie led Ayanna toward the house, chattering about her collection of cornhusk dolls and the tea set that had belonged to her mother, Jake found himself alone with his 2 older daughters. Papa, Mary said quietly, are you sure about this? Jake sat down on the front steps of the house and gestured for his daughters to join him.
This conversation was too important to have standing up.
Mary, Beth, I want you to listen to me carefully, he began.
Ayanna is a good woman.
She's been through terrible things, lost her husband and her family, had no place to go. She needs help, and we have room in our house and in our lives. But, Papa, Beth said, she's Apache.
People in town won't like it. Jake nodded grimly.
His 10-year-old daughter had put her finger on the heart of the problem. Socorro was not a particularly tolerant town when it came to Indians. There had been too much blood spilled on both sides, too much fear and hatred built up over the years.
You're right, he admitted. Some people in town will be upset. They might say mean things about us, about her. They might not want to do business with us anymore. Mary frowned, working through the implications. Will we have to move away? I don't know, Jake said honestly. Maybe. Would that scare you?
Mary and Beth exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that sisters have been having since the beginning of time. Finally, Mary spoke for both of them. Papa, when Mama died, you told us that the most important thing was to stick together as a family.
You said that as long as we had each other, we could get through anything. That's right, Jake said.
Well, Mary continued with the logic of a child who has learned to think like an adult. If Ayanna is going to be our new mother, then she's family.
And families stick together. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion.
These girls of his, they had grown up so much in the 2 years since Sarah died. They had learned to be strong, to think for themselves, to see beyond the surface of things to what really mattered.
Are you sure? He asked. Both of you? Because once we do this, there's no going back. People will remember.
They'll talk about it for years. Beth shrugged with the casual indifference of youth.
People already talk about us. Mrs. Henderson says we're growing up wild because we don't have a proper mother. Maybe now they'll have something else to talk about.
The sound of laughter from inside the house drew their attention. Through the open door, they could see Annie showing Ayanna her treasures while the Apache woman admired each doll and listened with genuine interest to the elaborate stories that went with them.
Look at her, Mary said quietly. She's not scary at all. She's just lonely. Like we were after Mama died.
Jake watched his youngest daughter and the woman who might become her new mother, and felt something settle into place in his chest.
This was right.
It might be complicated, it might cause problems, but it was the right thing to do. Okay then, he said, standing up and brushing the dust off his pants. But first, I need to have a talk with Sheriff Williams. And then, we need to have a town meeting. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, out in the open where everyone can see. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jake left his daughters with strict instructions to make Ayanna comfortable while he rode into town to handle the official business of his situation. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Bill Williams cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a man who had learned to depend on his weapons. "Jake," Williams said, looking up from his work.
"Heard you went after them Apache that hit the Henderson place. Any luck?"
"Some," Jake said, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. "Found Tom and Martha dead, like we expected.
But I also found something else." Jake told the story of tracking the Apache raiding party, finding their camp, and rescuing Ayanna from captivity.
He left out some of the details, the exact number of warriors he had killed, the brutal efficiency with which he had conducted the fight, but he gave Williams enough information to understand what had happened. "So you brought her back here," Williams said when Jake finished his account.
"Apache woman, no family, no place to go."
"That's right." Williams set down his rifle and leaned back in his chair, studying Jake's face with the shrewd eyes of a man who had spent 20 years reading people's intentions.
"And what exactly are you planning to do with her?"
"I'm planning to marry her," Jake said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Williams' eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but, to his credit, he did not immediately explode with objections or warnings. "Jake," he said finally, "you know what kind of reaction that's going to get from folks around here."
"I know. There'll be some that call it an abomination. Others that say you've lost your mind with grief.
And there's likely to be some that figure she's bewitched you somehow, put some kind of Indian spell on you."
Jake nodded. He had thought of all of these objections during the ride home. "What do you think, Bill?"
Williams was quiet for a long time, considering his words carefully. Jake Morrison was not a man given to foolish impulses. He was steady, reliable, and as honest as any man Williams had known in his years of law enforcement. If Jake said he wanted to marry this Apache woman, then he had good reasons for it. "I think," Williams said slowly, "that you're either the bravest man I know or the stupidest."
"Maybe both."
He paused, then added, "But I also think you're a good judge of character."
"If you say she's worth the risk, then I'll take your word for it." Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders.
Having the sheriff's support would not solve all of his problems, but it would help immensely in the battles to come.
I want to call a town meeting for tomorrow night, Jake said. Let everyone have their say, get it all out in the open. If they want us to leave, then we'll leave.
But I won't have folks whispering behind our backs or my girls growing up ashamed of who they are.
Williams nodded approvingly. That's the right way to handle it.
I'll spread the word, make sure everyone knows to come to the church.
7 o'clock tomorrow night.
Jake's next stop was the general store, where he needed supplies but also wanted to gauge the reaction of the town's business community. Word of his return with an Apache woman was already spreading, and he could feel the eyes following him as he walked down Main Street. Inside Murphy's general store, the conversation stopped as soon as Jake walked through the door. Tom Murphy, a thin, nervous man who had run the store for 15 years, looked up from his ledger with undisguised curiosity. "Morning, Jake," Murphy said carefully. "Heard you had quite an adventure."
"Morning, Tom.
I need some supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and some fabric if you have it.
Good quality, suitable for making dresses."
Murphy's eyebrows rose at the last item, but he began gathering the requested supplies without comment. It was Mrs. Murphy who could not resist asking the question that was on everyone's mind. "Jake," she said, emerging from the back room where she had been organizing inventory, "people are saying you brought back one of them Apache women.
That true?" Jake met her eyes steadily. "It's true, Alice. Her name is Ayanna.
She was a captive of the same war party that killed Tom and Martha Henderson.
I brought her to safety.
And now she's staying at your place," Mrs. Murphy continued, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity.
"That's right."
"With your girls."
"That's right."
Alice Murphy absorbed this information with the calculating look of a woman who was already determining how this news would affect her standing in the complex social hierarchy of Socorro. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose everyone will have opinions about that." "I suppose they will," Jake agreed. "But my girls like her, and that's what matters to me." As Jake finished his shopping and loaded his purchases onto his wagon, he was aware of the conversations that stopped when he approached and resumed when he moved away. The news was spreading like wildfire through the small town, and, by evening, everyone in Socorro would know about the Apache woman staying at Jake Morrison's house.
The ride home gave Jake time to think about what lay ahead. Tomorrow night's town meeting would be crucial.
He needed to present Ayanna not as a dangerous savage who had somehow bewitched him, but as a woman in need who could contribute to their community. It would not be easy, but Jake had faced difficult situations before. When he arrived home, he found a scene that filled him with quiet satisfaction. Ayanna was in the kitchen with Mrs. Garcia, helping to prepare the evening meal while Annie sat at the table carefully drawing pictures of horses. Mary and Beth were setting the table, chattering about their day and including Ayanna in their conversation as if she had always been part of the family.
"Papa,"
Annie called out when she saw him come through the door.
"Ayanna knows how to make bread.
She showed me how to knead the dough." Jake looked at the Apache woman who was carefully shaping loaves while his youngest daughter watched with fascination.
Ayanna's movements were quick and efficient, and Jake could see that she was completely comfortable in the domestic setting.
"Smells good in here," Jake said, setting down his packages.
"How's everyone getting along?"
"Ayanna told us stories about horses that can run faster than the wind," Beth said excitedly. "And she's teaching Mary how to braid her hair in a new way." Jake caught Ayanna's eye across the room and saw something there that had not been present that morning. For the first time since he had found her in the Apache camp, she looked relaxed, almost happy. Being with his daughters, having a role to play and a purpose to fulfill, had awakened something in her that captivity had nearly extinguished. That evening, after Mrs. Garcia had gone home and the girls were asleep in their beds, Jake and Ayanna sat on the front porch and talked about the future. The desert night was cool and clear, with a million stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. "The town meeting tomorrow," Ayanna said quietly.
"It will not go well." Jake nodded.
There was no point in lying to her about what they would face.
"Some folks will be against it, no question. But some might surprise us."
And, the girls, they already think of you as family. Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring out at the distant mountains. Why are you doing this? She asked finally. You could find a white woman to marry, someone who would not bring trouble to your family. Jake considered the question seriously. It was one he had been asking himself since the moment he decided to bring her home. Because it's right, he said finally. Because my girls need a mother, and you need a family. Because I think you'll be good for them, and maybe they'll be good for you too. And, because, he continued, surprising himself with his honesty, I think Sarah would have wanted it this way. She always said the measure of a person wasn't the color of their skin or where they came from, but how they treated others. Ayanna turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And, I think she would have liked you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the wind rustled through the mesquite bushes that grew around the house. Jake, Ayanna said eventually, if we do this thing, if we become a family, people will try to hurt your daughters because of me. Are you prepared for that? Jake's jaw tightened, and his hand moved instinctively to the butt of his revolver. Anyone who tries to hurt my girls will answer to me. And, after tomorrow night, that'll be clear to everyone in Socorro. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with not a cloud in the sky. Jake spent the day working around the ranch, fixing fence and tending to the horses, but his mind was on the evening ahead. The town meeting would determine not just his family's future, but also whether Socorro was the kind of place where decent people could live according to their conscience. As the sun began to set, Jake helped Ayanna get ready for what would be her first public appearance as a member of the Morrison family. She had bathed and braided her hair carefully, and she wore one of Sarah's dresses that Mary had altered to fit her smaller frame. The effect was striking. She looked dignified, respectable, and completely at ease with herself. Remember, Jake said as they prepared to leave for the church, you don't have to convince anyone of anything tonight. Just be yourself. Let them see who you really are. Ayanna nodded, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. This would not be easy for her, facing a room full of people who had been taught to see her as an enemy. As they walked toward the church, with his 3 daughters flanking them like an honor guard, Jake Morrison felt a sense of destiny settling over him. Whatever happened tonight would change their lives forever. But, as he looked at his family, the wife he had chosen and the daughters who had already embraced her, he knew that some risks were worth taking. The church bell was ringing as they approached the white adobe building that served as Socorro's spiritual and community center. Through the windows, Jake could see that the building was packed with people. It seemed like every adult in town had come to witness this historic moment. Taking a deep breath, Jake Morrison opened the door and led his family into the future. The interior of Socorro's small church had never held so many people. Every pew was packed, with men standing along the walls and women sitting on folding chairs brought from the school. The air was thick with tension and the smell of coal oil lamps, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. When Jake Morrison walked through the door with Ayanna and his 3 daughters, a complete silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned to watch their entrance, and Jake could feel the weight of 47 pairs of eyes examining every detail of their appearance. Ayanna walked with her head held high, her dark eyes meeting the stares without flinching. She wore Sarah Morrison's best blue dress, altered by Mary to fit her smaller frame, and her long black hair was braided with simple dignity. There was nothing threatening or savage about her appearance. She looked like what she was, a woman who had known both great loss and quiet strength. Mary, Beth, and Annie flanked their father and Ayanna like a protective guard, their young faces serious with the understanding that this moment would determine their family's future. Mary held Annie's hand tightly, while Beth stayed close to Ayanna's side, her chin raised in defiant loyalty. Sheriff Williams stood at the front of the church, his badge gleaming in the lamplight. As the designated moderator of this unprecedented gathering, he commanded respect from both the supporters and opponents in the room. Folks, Williams began, his voice carrying clearly to the back rows, we're here tonight because Jake Morrison has something he wants to say to all of us. I expect everyone to listen respectfully and keep their opinions civil. This is a church, and we'll conduct ourselves accordingly. Jake walked to the front of the room, leaving Ayanna and the girls in the front pew. He had thought carefully about what he would say, but now, facing the assembled citizens of Socorro, he decided to speak from his heart rather than from any prepared remarks. "Most of you know me," Jake began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I've lived in this territory for 15 years. I've ranched here, raised my family here, and I've never asked this community for anything I wasn't willing to give in return." Murmurs of agreement came from several corners of the room. Jake Morrison was well respected, known for his honesty and his willingness to help neighbors in times of trouble. 3 days ago, I tracked the Apache war party that killed Tom and Martha Henderson. I found their camp, and I found something else: a woman who had been taken captive by the same warriors who murdered our friends. Jake paused, letting his words sink in. This woman, Ayanna, is Apache, but she was not part of the raid. She was a victim, just like Tom and Martha. Her husband and brother had been killed by the same war party that took her prisoner. From somewhere in the middle of the church, a voice called out, "So why didn't you just turn her over to the Indian agent?" Jake turned toward the speaker, a rancher named Carl Brennan who had lost cattle to Apache raids over the years. "Because she had nowhere to go, Carl. Her husband's people blamed her for his death, and her own people had cast her out. She was alone in the world." "That's not our problem," Brennan shot back. "We've got enough trouble with Indians without bringing them into our homes." "Maybe it should be our problem," Jake replied evenly. "Maybe it's time we started thinking about Indians as people instead of just problems." A woman in the back of the church stood up. It was Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Mr. Morrison, we all respect what you did for this woman. It was Christian charity. But surely you can't expect us to accept her as a permanent member of our community." "Why not?" The question came from an unexpected source, Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, who rarely spoke at public gatherings. "Mrs. Patterson, you've taught our children to treat all people with kindness and respect. Shouldn't we practice what we preach?" Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red. "That's different, doctor. We're talking about savage Indians." "Are we?" Dr. Hayes stood up, his medical bag at his feet. "Because I've examined this woman, at Mr. Morrison's request. She's intelligent, well-spoken, and shows no signs of the violence or instability that our prejudices might lead us to expect." The crowd stirred at this unexpected support. Dr. Hayes was known for his conservative views and his methodical approach to problems. If he was willing to vouch for Ayanna, it carried significant weight. Furthermore, the doctor continued, "I've observed her interaction with the Morrison children. She demonstrates a natural maternal instinct and a genuine affection for those girls. In my medical opinion, she would be beneficial to their development." Carl Brennan stood up again, his face red with anger. "This is insane. We're talking about letting a hostile Indian live among us, sleep in our beds, influence our children. What's next? Are we going to invite the whole Apache Nation to move into Socorro?" "Ayanna is not the Apache Nation," Jake said firmly. "She's one woman who needs help. And my daughters need a mother." "Your daughters need a proper white woman for a mother," Mrs. Henderson called out. She was Tom Henderson's sister, recently arrived from Colorado to settle her brother's affairs. "Not some squaw who might slit their throats in the night." The word squaw hit the church like a slap. Ayanna visibly flinched, and little Annie turned to look at her with confusion and concern. Mary Morrison rose from her seat, her young face blazing with indignation. "Don't you dare call her that," Mary said in a voice that carried clearly through the church. At 12 years old, she looked tiny facing down the assembled adults, but her courage was unmistakable. "Ayanna has been nothing but kind to us. She's taught me how to braid my hair and helped Annie with her letters. She makes Papa smile again." Mrs. Henderson's face softened slightly. "Child, you don't understand." "I understand plenty," Mary shot back. "I understand that Mama died and we were sad and lonely. I understand that Ayanna lost her family too, and she knows what that feels like. I understand that when Annie has nightmares, Ayanna sits with her and sings until she goes back to sleep. Beth Morrison stood up next to her sister, her 10-year-old voice trembling with emotion. And I understand that some people in this room are being mean to someone who never hurt anybody. The church fell silent as the two girls faced down the adult community with nothing but their own moral courage. Then, to everyone's surprise, little Annie Morrison stood up as well. At 8 years old, she was barely tall enough to see over the pew in front of her, but her voice was clear and strong. Ayanna makes the best bread I ever tasted, she announced solemnly. And she knows stories about talking animals. And she smells like sage and sunshine. The simple honesty of the child's words had more impact than any adult argument could have managed. Several women in the congregation smiled despite themselves, and Jake saw some of the hostility begin to drain from the room. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the Catholic priest who served Socorro's Mexican families, rose from his seat near the altar. I have been listening to this debate with interest, he said in his careful English, still touched with the accent of his native Mexico. And I am reminded of a story from Scripture. The crowd settled back to listen. Father Rodriguez commanded respect across ethnic lines in Socorro, and his words carried weight with both the Anglo and Hispanic members of the community. There was once a woman, the priest continued, who was cast out by her people for circumstances beyond her control. She was alone, without family or homeland. But she found refuge with people who were different from her, and she became a blessing to them. Her name was Ruth, and she said to her new family, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people." Father Rodriguez looked directly at Ayanna as he spoke the next words. God does not judge us by the color of our skin or the place of our birth. He judges us by the love in our hearts and the kindness of our actions. An uncomfortable shuffling went through the congregation. It was hard to argue with Scripture, especially when it was quoted by a man of God. Judge Harrison, Socorro's senior magistrate, cleared his throat and stood up. A thin, intellectual man in his 60s, he commanded respect through his fairness and his thorough knowledge of territorial law. This discussion is all very well, the judge said, but we must also consider the legal implications of what Mr. Morrison is proposing. Marriage between whites and Indians is not specifically prohibited by territorial law, but it is unusual. There could be challenges to the validity of such a union. Are you saying it would be illegal? Jake asked. Judge Harrison considered the question carefully. Not illegal, no. But it could complicate matters of inheritance, property rights, and the legal status of any children born to the union. The territorial government in Santa Fe might view such a marriage with suspicion. Dr. Hayes spoke up again. Judge, you've just described complications, not impossibilities. Difficult legal situations can be navigated by competent attorneys. That's true, the judge admitted. And I must say that Mr. Morrison has conducted himself honorably in this matter. He has come before the community openly, asking for our acceptance rather than simply proceeding in secret. That speaks well of his character and his intentions. The debate continued for another hour, with voices both for and against Jake's proposal. Some spoke from genuine concern for the welfare of the children, while others made no attempt to hide their racial prejudices. But, gradually, a pattern began to emerge. The people who actually knew Jake Morrison, his neighbors, his business partners, the families who had benefited from his help over the years, were more willing to trust his judgment. It was Tom Murphy from the general store who finally asked the crucial question. Jake, what exactly are you asking of us? Do you want our permission to marry this woman? Our blessing? Or are you just informing us of what you intend to do regardless of our opinions? Jake had been waiting for this question. Tom, I don't need anyone's permission to marry Ayanna. If we choose to become husband and wife, we'll do so with or without this community's approval. But my daughters will be growing up in this town, and I want them to be accepted here. I want Ayanna to be accepted here. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as possible. I'm asking you to give her a chance. Get to know her before you judge her. See what kind of person she really is, not what your fears and prejudices tell you she might be. Sheriff Williams sensed that the moment had come for a decision.
Folks, I think we've heard from everyone who has something to say. The question before us is simple. Are we willing to accept Ayanna into our community as Jake Morrison's wife and as a mother to his children? I call for a vote, declared Mrs. Davidson, the mayor's wife.
She was a formidable woman who had organized every church social and school fundraiser for the past decade. All those in favor of accepting this marriage and welcoming Ayanna to Socorro, please stand. The moment of truth had arrived. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, Dr. Hayes rose to his feet, followed quickly by Father Rodriguez. Judge Harrison stood more slowly, his decision clearly difficult but ultimately clear. One by one, other members of the community began to rise.
The Mexican families, led by Father Rodriguez, stood almost as a group.
Several of the older women, perhaps thinking of their own experiences with loss and displacement, added their support. Some of the younger men, influenced by changing attitudes about race and frontier democracy, joined them. When the standing stopped, Sheriff Williams counted quickly. 26 in favor, he announced. All those opposed, please stand.
This time, fewer people rose.
Carl Brennan and his supporters made up the core of the opposition, along with Mrs. Henderson and about 15 others. They were a significant minority, but a minority nonetheless.
17 opposed, Williams announced.
The measure passes. The church erupted in conversation as people began to file out, some stopping to congratulate Jake or speak to Ayanna, others leaving quickly to avoid further confrontation. It had not been an overwhelming victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the crowd thinned, Jake found himself surrounded by his supporters. Dr. Hayes shook his hand warmly, while Father Rodriguez offered his blessing for the marriage. Judge Harrison promised to help with any legal complications that might arise. But it was Mrs. Davidson who surprised Jake the most. The mayor's wife approached Ayanna directly, extending her hand in formal greeting. "My dear," she said in her precise Boston accent, "I hope you will consider joining Our Ladies Auxiliary. We meet every Tuesday afternoon to work on quilts and discuss community matters. I think you would be a valuable addition to our group." Ayanna took the offered hand, her eyes wide with surprise.
"Thank you," she said simply. "I would be honored."
As they walked home through the cool desert night, Jake's family was quiet, each member processing the events of the evening in their own way. The vote had been closer than Jake would have liked, but it represented acceptance by a majority of their neighbors. "Papa," Mary said as they reached their front porch, "some of those people said mean things about Ayanna."
"Yes, they did," Jake acknowledged.
"And they might say more mean things in the future."
"Are you prepared for that?"
Mary looked at Ayanna, who was lifting a sleepy Annie into her arms. "If they're mean to her, they're being mean to our family. And we stick together."
Beth nodded emphatically.
"Besides, Mrs. Davidson likes her. And Mrs. Davidson is the most important lady in town." Jake laughed, some of the tension of the evening finally releasing.
"That's true. If Mrs. Davidson approves, then we're probably going to be just fine."
As they entered the house, Ayanna lingered on the porch for a moment, looking back toward the church where her fate had been decided. Jake joined her, following her gaze toward the building that was now just a dark silhouette against the starry sky.
"Regrets?" he asked. Ayanna shook her head slowly. "No regrets. But I am thinking about what your daughter said, that families stick together.
I have not been part of a real family for a long time." Jake put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that felt both natural and right.
"Well, you're part of one now.
For better or worse." "For better or worse," she agreed, and they went inside to begin their new life together. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to the Morrison house.
Some came out of curiosity, others to offer congratulations or to meet Ayanna properly.
A few came to make their opposition clear, but they were in the minority. Mrs. Garcia arrived early, as she always did, but her attitude toward Ayanna had changed overnight. Where before she had been polite but distant, now she was welcoming and eager to help plan for the wedding.
"Señora," she said to Ayanna, "we must talk about the ceremony." Father Rodriguez, he will perform the marriage, yes? And we will need flowers and food for the celebration after. Ayana looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention to wedding details. I have never planned a wedding before. In my people's tradition, the ceremonies are very different.
Mary Morrison, who had been listening from the kitchen table where she was helping Annie with her letters, looked up with interest.
What kind of ceremonies? Ayana smiled, settling into a chair next to the girls.
Apache wedding customs are simple but meaningful.
The families exchange gifts, and there is dancing and singing.
The bride and groom drink from the same cup to show they will share everything in life.
That sounds beautiful, Mary said. Could we do some of both? The Apache way and the white way?
Jake, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room.
I think that's a wonderful idea.
Our marriage should honor both traditions. And so, as Socorro slowly adjusted to the idea of having an Apache woman as a permanent resident, the Morrison family began planning a wedding that would bridge two worlds. It would not be easy, there would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt in the months and years to come. But, on that bright morning after the town meeting, with his daughters chattering excitedly about wedding plans and Ayana beginning to smile with genuine happiness, Jake Morrison felt that they had already won the most important battle. They had won the right to be a family, on their own terms, in their own way. Everything else would simply be details to work out along the way. The wedding of Jake Morrison and Ayana took place on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after the town meeting that had changed everything. Father Rodriguez had spent considerable time preparing for the ceremony, consulting with both Jake and Ayana about how to blend their different traditions into something that would honor both cultures while satisfying the requirements of Christian marriage. The church was decorated with wildflowers that Mary and Beth had gathered from the desert surrounding Socorro, their bright yellows and purples creating a cheerful contrast to the simple white walls. Mrs. Davidson had organized the ladies' auxiliary to prepare a feast for after the ceremony, while Dr. Hayes had volunteered to serve as Jake's best man, a gesture that carried significant meaning given his public support during the town meeting. Ayana wore a dress that represented the fusion of worlds that their marriage symbolized. The basic design was that of a traditional white wedding gown, sewn by Mrs. Garcia and several other women in town who had volunteered their skills. But the dress was decorated with intricate beadwork in Apache patterns, created by Ayana herself during the long evenings as she prepared for her new life. Mary Morrison had appointed herself as Ayana's maid of honor, a role she took with the utmost seriousness. She had spent hours learning to braid flowers into hair and had practiced walking slowly down the aisle until she could do it without giggling. Beth and Annie were flower girls, their excitement barely contained as they clutched their baskets of desert blooms. The congregation was smaller than it had been for the town meeting, but it included all of the people who truly mattered. Sheriff Williams sat in the front row, his badge polished to a bright shine for the occasion. Judge Harrison was present, having volunteered to handle all the legal paperwork to ensure the marriage would be recognized without question by territorial authorities. Several surprising faces appeared among the guests. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher who had initially opposed Ayana's acceptance, had come to the wedding with a small gift wrapped in brown paper. Even Carl Brennan was present, though he sat in the back and avoided eye contact with the wedding party. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was that of Elena Vasquez, an elderly woman from the Mexican side of town who had known loss and displacement herself. She had sought out Ayana the week before the wedding to offer her blessing and to share some traditional Mexican wedding customs that might complement the Apache traditions Ayana wanted to include. Father Rodriguez began the ceremony with a prayer that asked for God's blessing on this union that would bring together not just two people, but two cultures. His words were carefully chosen to emphasize unity, love, and the importance of family in God's plan for humanity. Marriage, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, is not just the joining of two individuals, but the creation of something new and greater than the sum of its parts. Today, Jake and Ayana do not just promise to love each other, but to build a family that will be a bridge between worlds. The ceremony included traditional Christian vows, but it also incorporated elements that Ayana had requested. She and Jake drank from a shared cup of water, symbolizing their commitment to share all of life's experiences. they exchanged not just rings, but also small bundles of sage, representing the prayers and good wishes of their respective peoples. When Father Rodriguez pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and celebration. Mary, Beth, and Annie rushed forward to embrace their new mother, while the congregation rose to offer their congratulations. The celebration that followed took place in the church hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families from across Socorro. There was traditional Mexican fare prepared by Elena Vesquez and her daughters, hearty American dishes from the Anglo families, and even some Apache-style corn cakes that Ayana had taught Mrs. Garcia to make. Dr. Hayes rose to offer a toast, his glass raised high. "To Jake and Ayana Morrison," he said, "may your marriage be as strong as this frontier that has brought us all together, and may your family be an example to all of us of what is possible when we choose love over fear." The months that followed the wedding were a period of adjustment for everyone involved. Ayana threw herself into her new role as wife and mother with determination and grace. She learned to cook American-style meals while introducing her family to Apache dishes. She helped Mary and Beth with their schoolwork while Annie taught her new mother English words that she did not know. The integration into Socorro's social fabric was gradual but steady. Mrs. Davidson had been true to her word about including Ayana in the ladies' auxiliary, and the Tuesday afternoon meetings became an important part of Ayana's week. At first, some of the other women were stiff and formal around her, but her quiet dignity and willingness to help with any task gradually won them over. It was during one of these meetings that Ayana first demonstrated the healing skills she had learned from her grandmother. Mrs. Henderson, who had initially been one of her harshest critics, came to the meeting with a severe headache that had been plaguing her for days. When Ayana quietly offered to help, mixing a tea from herbs she grew in her garden, Mrs. Henderson was desperate enough to try anything. The tea worked, providing relief that Dr. Hayes' remedies had not been able to accomplish. Word spread quickly through the town about Ayana's knowledge of medicinal plants, and soon women were coming to her for help with ailments ranging from stomach troubles to difficult pregnancies. Dr. Hayes, rather than seeing Ayana as competition, was fascinated by her traditional knowledge. He began consulting with her about cases where conventional medicine had failed, and together they developed treatments that combined the best of both approaches. Their collaboration became the talk of Socorro, demonstrating once again that different traditions could strengthen each other rather than compete. The children adapted to their new family structure with the resilience that only the young possess. Mary blossomed under Ayana's patient guidance, learning not just domestic skills but also developing a confidence that came from having a strong female role model. Beth's natural energy found new outlets as Ayana taught her tracking skills and the Apache understanding of desert survival. But it was little Annie who formed the strongest bond with her new mother. The 8-year-old had been too young to retain many clear memories of her birth mother, and she embraced Ayana with the wholehearted acceptance that children reserve for those they instinctively trust. Ayana, in turn, seemed to find healing for her own losses in caring for this small girl who needed so much love and attention. The first real test of the family's new dynamic came in December, when Socorro experienced an unusually harsh winter storm. Snow blocked the roads for nearly a week, isolating individual families and testing everyone's resources. It was during this time that Ayana's frontier skills proved invaluable. While other families worried about running out of food, Ayana knew how to make nutritious meals from stored corn and beans. When the Morrisons' water pump froze, she knew how to melt snow efficiently and purify it for drinking. Most importantly, when Mrs. Garcia's grandson fell seriously ill with pneumonia and Dr. Hayes could not get through the snow to treat him, Ayana's knowledge of traditional remedies may have saved the boy's life. The experience left no doubt in anyone's mind that Ayana was not just an ornamental addition to the Morrison family, but a valuable member of the Socorro community. Her skills, knowledge, and quiet strength had proven themselves when they were most needed. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Jake's ranch was prospering, partly due to Ayana's knowledge of plants and animals that helped him make better use of the desert environment. She identified grasses that were more nutritious for cattle and showed him water sources that he had never noticed before. But, more importantly, spring brought the news that Ayana was pregnant. The announcement caused a stir throughout Socorro, as people realized that this child would be something new, neither fully white nor fully Apache, but something that represented the possibility of a different kind of future. Some of the old opposition to the marriage resurfaced with this news.
Carl Brennan and
A few of his supporters grumbled about half-breed children and what their presence might mean for the town's future. But they were increasingly outnumbered by families who had come to respect and even love Ayanna.
Mrs. Davidson, now one of Ayanna's staunchest supporters, shut down such talk with characteristic directness.
This child will be an American, born on American soil to American parents, she declared at one particularly heated ladies' auxiliary meeting.
And anyone who suggests otherwise can answer to me.
Dr. Hayes took special interest in Ayanna's pregnancy, fascinated by the opportunity to learn about Apache birthing customs and traditional approaches to prenatal care.
His collaboration with Ayanna had made him something of an expert on combining traditional and modern medical practices, and he was eager to apply this knowledge to ensure the health of both mother and child. As summer approached and Ayanna's pregnancy progressed, the whole family began preparing for the new arrival.
Mary and Beth delighted in discussing names and arguing about whether they wanted a brother or sister. Annie, who would no longer be the baby of the family, seemed more excited than anyone about becoming a big sister. Jake found himself marveling at how completely his life had changed in less than a year. The lonely widower who had ridden out to track Apache raiders had been replaced by a man with a thriving family and a place in a community that had learned to embrace difference rather than fear it. One evening in July, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple, Ayanna placed Jake's hand on her growing belly so he could feel the baby's movement. "This child," she said quietly, "will grow up knowing both worlds.
Apache and white, desert and town, traditional ways and new possibilities." Jake nodded, thinking about the implications of what she said.
Their child would indeed be something new, a bridge between cultures in a way that no previous generation had experienced.
"Are you worried about that?" he asked. "About how the child will be received?" Ayanna considered the question seriously.
"There will be challenges," she admitted. "Some people will never accept a child who is both Apache and white.
But look at what we have accomplished here.
A year ago, the people of Socorro thought an Apache woman could never be part of their community.
Now I serve on the church committee and help deliver their babies."
She paused, her hand covering Jake's on her belly. "This child will have advantages that neither of us had. They will understand both cultures, speak both languages, and know that love is stronger than prejudice. They will be able to build bridges that we could never build." As if responding to their mother's words, the baby kicked vigorously, causing both parents to laugh. The sound echoed across the desert evening, mixing with the calls of coyotes in the distance and the gentle sound of wind through the mesquite trees. That night, as Jake lay awake listening to Ayanna's gentle breathing beside him, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with violence and death at the Henderson Ranch, continued through the dangerous rescue in the Apache camp, and led to this moment of peace and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did on the frontier. There would be drought or flood, sickness or injury, the constant struggle to make a living from unforgiving land. There would be people who never accepted their family, who saw their mixed marriage as an abomination rather than a blessing. But tonight, Jake Morrison was exactly where he wanted to be, surrounded by family, part of a community that had learned to grow and change, and looking forward to a future that held infinite possibilities. Outside their window, the desert stretched away toward mountains and mesas that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph. And, somewhere in that vastness, the child who would represent a new kind of hope was growing toward the light, ready to take their place in a world that was slowly learning that love could indeed conquer fear. The birth of Samuel Morrison came on a warm September evening, attended by both Dr. Hayes and Elena Vasquez, who had learned Apache birthing customs from Ayanna during her pregnancy. The combination of medical knowledge and traditional wisdom created an atmosphere of confidence and support that helped make the delivery smooth and safe. When Jake first held his son, he was struck by how perfectly the child seemed to embody both of his parents. Samuel had Ayanna's dark hair and eyes, but Jake's strong jawline and broad shoulders were already evident even in his infant features. More importantly, the baby seemed to radiate a sense of belonging that spoke to his unique heritage. "He is beautiful," Ayanna whispered as she cradled her son for the first time. "He will be strong like his father and wise like his ancestors." The girls had been waiting anxiously in the parlor during the birth, and, when Dr.
Hayes finally allowed them to meet their new brother, their excitement was infectious.
Mary approached with the careful reverence of a 12-year-old who understood the magnitude of the moment, while Beth bounced on her toes with barely contained energy.
Annie, now 9 and
feeling very grown up, announced that she would teach Samuel everything he needed to know about being part of their family. News of Samuel's birth spread quickly through Socorro, and the response revealed how much the community's attitudes had evolved over the past year. Mrs. Davidson arrived the next morning with a beautiful hand-knitted blanket, while Mrs. Patterson brought a small wooden toy horse carved by her husband. Even Carl Brennan, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the marriage, sent congratulations through his wife.
Father Rodriguez came to bless the baby and to discuss plans for the christening.
The ceremony, he suggested, could incorporate both Christian and Apache traditions, just as the wedding had done. Samuel would be baptized in the church, but Ayanna could also perform the traditional Apache naming ceremony that would connect the child to his ancestral heritage.
Dr.
Hayes became a frequent visitor during the weeks following Samuel's birth, fascinated by the opportunity to observe how Apache and white child-rearing practices could be combined. He took careful notes as Ayanna shared traditional knowledge about infant care, from the herbs that could soothe colic to the songs that would help a baby sleep. The doctor's documentation of these practices would eventually become part of a book he wrote about frontier medicine, helping to preserve traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. But, more immediately, his obvious respect for Ayanna's expertise continued to enhance her standing in the community. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, it became clear that he would indeed be a bridge between worlds, just as his parents had hoped. He learned English from his father and sisters, but Ayanna spoke to him in Apache as well, ensuring that he would be fluent in both languages. She taught him traditional songs and stories, while Jake showed him how to ride and work with cattle. The boy's mixed heritage, which some had feared would make him an outcast, instead seemed to give him unique advantages. He understood both cultures intuitively, moving easily between the Anglo world of Socorroan